Staff Sergeant Maria Santos stepped out of the Black Hawk helicopter onto the dusty tarmac of forward operating Base Phoenix in Afghanistan. The rotors were still spinning, creating a whirlwind of sand and debris that stung her face. She squinted through her flight goggles and saw them again, the same group of male pilots standing near the hangar, arms crossed, watching her with those familiar looks of doubt and dismissal. "There goes the diversity hire," she heard one of them mutter, though he tried to keep his voice low. The comment wasn't meant for her ears, but the desert air carried sound farther than people thought. Maria had heard variations of that phrase more times than she could count during her 2 years as a military helicopter pilot. Captain Jake Morrison, the squadron's golden boy, was leading the group as usual. He had perfect teeth, perfect flight scores, and a perfect attitude that made Maria want to punch something. "I still can't believe they sent us a girl to fly combat missions," he said, loud enough for Maria to hear this time. "What's next? Are they going to send us kindergarten teachers?" The other pilots laughed. Maria kept walking toward the operations building, her flight bag slung over her shoulder. She had learned early in her career that responding to comments like that only made things worse. Better to let her flying do the talking, even though it seemed like no matter how well she performed, there was always another excuse for why she didn't belong. Inside the operations center, Colonel Thompson was studying a map spread across a large table. Red pins marked enemy positions, blue pins showed friendly forces, and yellow pins indicated areas where intelligence was uncertain. The situation in this part of Afghanistan had been getting worse by the day. Taliban forces were becoming more organized, more aggressive, and more willing to engage American troops in direct combat. "Santos," the colonel called out when he saw her enter. "Good timing. We need to talk about tomorrow's mission." Maria approached the table and studied the map. She could see immediately that they were planning something big. Multiple helicopter symbols were drawn in various positions, with arrows showing flight paths and assault vectors. This wasn't going to be a simple supply run or medical evacuation. "We're extracting a reconnaissance team that's been operating behind enemy lines for 2 weeks, Colonel Thompson explained. "They've gathered critical intelligence about Taliban supply routes, but their position has been compromised. We need to get them out before the enemy surrounds them completely." The extraction point was marked with a small circle on the map, deep in mountainous terrain that Maria knew would be challenging to navigate. The area was known for its unpredictable winds, narrow valleys, and numerous places where enemy fighters could hide with rocket-propelled grenades. "Who's flying lead on this one, sir?" Maria asked, though she already suspected she knew the answer. "Morrison will be leading the formation," the colonel replied. "You'll be flying support in the trail position." Trail position meant flying behind the other helicopters, providing cover and backup support. It was important work, but it also meant she wouldn't be the first pilot to reach the soldiers who needed help. Maria had been hopping for a chance to prove herself by leading a major mission, but those opportunities always seemed to go to pilots with more seniority or better connections. "Understood, sir," she said, keeping any disappointment out of her voice. The briefing continued for another hour. Intelligence reports suggested that enemy forces in the area had been strengthened recently with fighters from Pakistan. These weren't local farmers with old rifles. They were experienced combatants with modern weapons and training. The Taliban had also been using new tactics, including coordinated attacks designed specifically to bring down American helicopters. As the briefing concluded, Maria gathered her notes and headed to the maintenance hangar to inspect her aircraft. Black Hawk helicopters were incredibly complex machines with thousands of moving parts, and a pilot's life depended on every single one of them working perfectly. She had developed her own pre-flight inspection routine that was more thorough than what the manual required. Chief Warrant Officer Rodriguez, the senior maintenance supervisor, was waiting by her helicopter. He was one of the few people on the base who treated Maria with the same respect he showed the male pilots. "Evening, Santos," he said. "I wanted to talk to you about something I noticed during today's maintenance check." They walked around the Black Hawk together as Rodriguez explained that he had found some unusual wear patterns on one of the rotor blade assemblies. The damage wasn't severe enough to ground the aircraft, but it was something that needed to be monitored carefully. "I've seen this kind of wear before," he said. "Usually happens when pilots push the aircraft harder than they should in difficult conditions." "Are you saying I've been flying too aggressively?" Maria asked. "Not at all," Rodriguez replied. I'm saying you've been flying the missions that other pilots don't want to take. The dangerous ones, the difficult ones, the ones where you have to push the aircraft to its limits just to get the job done. Your helicopter shows more wear because you're doing more real flying than anyone else in this squadron. That observation hit Maria harder than she expected. She had been taking on the most challenging assignments, partly because she wanted to prove herself, and partly because she genuinely cared about the soldiers who needed help. But she had never considered that her willingness to accept difficult missions might be seen as evidence of her skill rather than her desperation to fit in. Rodriguez continued his explanation of the maintenance issues while they completed the inspection. Everything else on the aircraft was in excellent condition. The engines were running smoothly, the weapons systems were properly calibrated, and all the communications equipment was functioning perfectly. Maria made notes on her flight log and signed off on the inspection. As she was preparing to leave the hangar, Captain Morrison and several other pilots walked in. They were laughing about something, probably another story about their latest conquest at the officers' club or their plans for leave time back in the United States. When they saw Maria, the laughter died down. "Santos," Morrison said, using the tone he might use to address a child, "I hope you're ready for tomorrow. This mission is going to be more challenging than the milk runs you're used to flying." Maria looked at him directly. "I've been flying combat missions in Afghanistan for 18 months, Captain. I think I can handle whatever tomorrow brings." "We'll see," Morrison replied with a smirk. "Just try to keep up and don't do anything that puts the rest of us in danger." The other pilots chuckled, and Maria felt her face getting hot. She wanted to remind Morrison that she had successfully completed every mission she had been assigned, including several where other pilots had requested to be excused due to weather or enemy activity. But she knew that defending herself would only make her look defensive. Instead, she simply said, "See you at the briefing, Captain," and walked away. Later that evening, Maria sat in her small quarters writing a letter to her younger sister back in Texas. Carmen was a senior in high school and had been asking Maria about her experiences as a pilot. Maria tried to focus on the positive aspects, the incredible views from the cockpit, the satisfaction of helping fellow soldiers, the technical challenges of flying such a sophisticated aircraft. But tonight she found herself struggling to write about the positive aspects. The constant questioning of her abilities was wearing her down. Every mistake she made was magnified, while her successes were minimized or attributed to luck. She had joined the military to serve her country and to pursue her dream of becoming a pilot. The dream part was working out exactly as she had hoped, but the service part was becoming more complicated. Maria had grown up in a small town where everyone knew everyone else's business. Her father worked at the local auto repair shop, and her mother cleaned houses for wealthy families. Neither of them had finished high school, but they had always emphasized the importance of education and hard work. When Maria announced that she wanted to join the military and become a pilot, her parents had been supportive but worried. "Flying helicopters is dangerous work, Mija," her mother had said, "and the military is not always kind to women." Her mother had been right about both things, but Maria had been determined to prove that she could succeed anyway. She had excelled in flight training, graduating near the top of her class and earning recognition for her technical skills. Her instructors had praised her ability to remain calm under pressure and her natural feel for aircraft control. But flight school had been different from operational duty. In training, performance was measured objectively through test scores and flight evaluations. In combat operations, there were too many variables and too much subjectivity. Politics and personalities mattered as much as skill and dedication. Maria finished her letter to Carmen and sealed it in an envelope. Tomorrow's mission would be another opportunity to prove herself, but she was beginning to wonder if any amount of proof would ever be enough. The pilots who doubted her abilities seemed determined to maintain their skepticism no matter what she accomplished. She spent the next hour studying the mission plans one more time. The intelligence reports suggested that the reconnaissance team had been gathering information about a major Taliban supply operation. If the intelligence was accurate, the information they had collected could save American lives and disrupt enemy operations for months to come. The extraction would be complicated by the terrain and the likelihood of enemy resistance. The reconnaissance team was located in a valley surrounded by high ridges where enemy fighters could position themselves with clear fields of fire. The helicopters would have to fly low and fast to avoid being targeted. but they would also need to slow down and hover while the soldiers climbed aboard. Maria studied the topographic maps and satellite imagery until she had memorized every detail of the landscape. She identified potential alternative landing zones in case the primary extraction point was compromised. She calculated fuel consumption rates and flight times for various scenarios. She reviewed the capabilities and limitations of the weapons systems on her aircraft. By the time she turned off her reading lamp and tried to get some sleep, Maria felt as prepared as she could possibly be for tomorrow's mission. She had done everything within her power to ensure success. Whether that would be enough remained to be seen. The base was quieter now, with most personnel settled in for the night. Through her window, Maria could see the flight line where the Black Hawk helicopters sat in neat rows, their rotor blades tied down against the constant wind. Tomorrow, those machines would carry her and her fellow pilots into harm's way once again. She closed her eyes and tried to push away thoughts about Captain Morrison's attitude and the other pilots' skepticism. Tomorrow would be about the mission and the soldiers who needed their help. Everything else was just noise that she couldn't afford to let distract her from the job at hand. But as sleep finally came, Maria couldn't completely shake the feeling that tomorrow would be different somehow. Something about this mission felt more significant than the routine operations she had been flying. Whether that difference would work in her favor or against her remained to be seen. The last thing she heard before drifting off was the distant sound of another helicopter returning from a night mission, its rotors beating steadily against the darkness as it brought more soldiers safely home. The pre-dawn briefing room buzzed with nervous energy as pilots and crew members gathered around the mission board. Maria arrived 15 minutes early, as was her habit, and took a seat in the back row. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows on everyone's faces, making them look older and more tired than they actually were. Colonel Thompson entered precisely at 500 hours, carrying a thick folder of intelligence reports and aerial photographs. Behind him came the intelligence officer, Major Stevens, who looked like he hadn't slept in days. When everyone was seated, the colonel began the final mission briefing. "Gentlemen," he said, then caught himself and glanced at Maria, "and lady, today's mission is critical. The reconnaissance team we're extracting has been operating in the Kunar province for 2 weeks. They've gathered intelligence that could save hundreds of American lives." Major Stevens took over, pointing to a large map projected on the wall. "The team is located here, in this valley approximately 60 kilometers from our current position. Intelligence suggests that Taliban forces have been moving into the area throughout the night. We expect significant resistance." Captain Morrison raised his hand. "What kind of resistance are we talking about, Major?" "Small arms fire is certain," Stevens replied. "We also have reports of possible RPG teams positioned on the ridgelines, and there's been chatter about a possible SA-7 surface-to-air missile in the area." A surface-to-air missile changed everything. The SA-7 was an old Soviet-era weapon, but it was still deadly against helicopters. If the Taliban had managed to acquire one, it would force the aircraft to fly lower and faster, making the extraction much more dangerous. Maria studied the map carefully, noting the narrow valley where the team was located. The terrain would funnel the helicopters through a predictable flight path, giving enemy fighters multiple opportunities to engage them. She raised her hand. "Major, do we have any information about the team's current condition? Are they mobile, or do they have wounded personnel?" Stevens consulted his notes. "Last communication was 6 hours ago. Team leader reported that all personnel were operational, but they've been moving continuously to avoid enemy patrols. We should assume they're tired and low on ammunition." Colonel Thompson resumed control of the briefing. "The mission will consist of 3 Black Hawks. Morrison will fly lead with a full squad of Marines for security. Santos will fly trail with medical personnel and additional ammunition. The third bird will carry more Marines and provide overwatch from a position outside the valley." Maria nodded, understanding her role. Trail position meant she would be responsible for covering the other helicopters during the extraction and providing medical support if anyone was wounded. It wasn't the glamorous lead position, but it was critically important. "Weather forecast?" asked Chief Warrant Officer Blake, one of the more experienced pilots. "Winds from the southwest at 15 to 20 knots, Stevens replied. "Visibility should be good, but there's a chance of afternoon thunderstorms developing over the mountains. The briefing continued with details about communications procedures, fuel calculations, and emergency protocols. Each pilot received a packet of maps, aerial photographs, and intelligence summaries. Maria studied hers carefully, noting potential landing zones and escape routes. After the formal briefing ended, the pilots gathered around the map table for a more detailed discussion of tactics. Morrison took charge of the conversation, as he usually did. "We'll approach from the east using this ridge line for cover," he said, tracing a route with his finger. "Santos, I want you to stay at least a quarter-mile behind us until we've secured the landing zone." "Understood," Maria replied. "What about extraction sequence? Do you want me to land first to set up medical support?" Morrison shook his head. "Negative. We'll handle the extraction. You just worry about staying out of the way and being ready if we need backup." Maria bit back her initial response. She wanted to point out that her aircraft was equipped with better medical facilities and that she had more training in combat medical procedures than anyone else in the formation. But questioning Morrison's plan in front of the other pilots would only reinforce their perception that she was difficult to work with. "Roger that," she said instead. The pilots dispersed to complete their individual preparations. Maria headed to the flight line to conduct her pre-flight inspection. The morning air was already getting warm, and she could tell it was going to be another scorching day. Afghanistan in summer was brutal, with temperatures regularly exceeding 110 degrees Fahrenheit. Her crew chief, Sergeant Martinez, was already at the helicopter running through the maintenance checklist. He was a young soldier from California who had joined the Army straight out of high school. Despite his youth, he was one of the best crew chiefs on the base, with an intuitive understanding of how helicopters worked. "Morning, Sergeant Santos," Martinez said. "Everything's looking good on the maintenance side. I did notice that the auxiliary power unit is running about 5 degrees hotter than normal, but it's still within acceptable parameters." Maria made a note on her checklist. A slightly hot APU could indicate developing problems with the engine cooling system, but Martinez was right that it wasn't an immediate concern. Still, it was something to monitor during the flight. They completed the pre-flight inspection together, checking everything from the main rotor blades to the landing gear. Maria tested all the flight controls, verified that the communications equipment was working properly, and confirmed that the medical supplies were properly secured. Her door gunner for today's mission was Corporal Johnson, a quiet soldier from North Carolina who had been deployed to Afghanistan for 8 months. Johnson was known for his steady nerves and accurate shooting, qualities that could prove crucial if they encountered enemy fire. "How are you feeling about today's mission, Corporal?" Maria asked as they completed the weapons check. "Ready to bring those boys home, ma'am," Johnson replied. "Been thinking about them all night, stuck out there with the Taliban closing in." That was exactly the right attitude. Johnson understood that their job wasn't about politics or personalities, it was about bringing fellow soldiers home safely. Maria wished more people on the base shared that perspective. As the departure time approached, Maria gathered her crew for a final briefing. They went over emergency procedures, communication protocols, and each person's responsibilities during different phases of the mission. Martinez would monitor the aircraft systems and assist with any wounded personnel they might need to transport. Johnson would provide security and cover fire if they came under attack. "Remember," Maria told them, "our primary job is to get those reconnaissance soldiers out of there alive. Everything else is secondary. If something goes wrong, follow your training and trust your instincts." The 3 helicopters started their engines simultaneously, filling the air with the distinctive whine of turboshaft engines spinning up to operating speed. Maria went through her engine start checklist methodically, monitoring temperatures and pressures to ensure everything was within normal limits. Morrison's voice crackled over the radio. "Phoenix flight, check in." "Phoenix 2 ready," Maria responded. "Phoenix 3 ready," called the pilot of the Overwatch helicopter. "Phoenix flight, we are cleared for takeoff. Let's bring our boys home." The helicopters lifted off in formation, climbing quickly to avoid any possible ground fire from around the base perimeter. Maria settled into the familiar rhythm of formation flying, maintaining her position relative to Morrison's aircraft while scanning the instrument panel for any signs of problems. The landscape below was a mixture of brown desert and green agricultural areas along the rivers. Afghan farmers were already working in their fields despite the early hour, trying to complete their labor before the day became too hot. From the air, it looked peaceful and pastoral, but Maria knew that appearances could be deceiving in this country. As they flew deeper into the mountains, the terrain became more rugged and hostile. Deep valleys cut between towering peaks that were still capped with snow despite the summer heat. This was perfect ambush country, with countless hiding places for enemy fighters and limited escape routes for aircraft in trouble. Morrison's helicopter began a gradual descent as they approached the target area. Maria could see the valley where the reconnaissance team was waiting, a narrow strip of relatively flat ground surrounded by steep ridges. It looked like a natural trap, and she wondered if the Taliban had chosen this area specifically to lure American helicopters into range of their weapons. "Phoenix Flight, we have eyes on the LZ," Morrison announced. "No sign of the ground team yet." That was concerning. The team should have been monitoring their radio frequencies and preparing for extraction. If they weren't visible, it could mean they were hiding from enemy forces or that something had happened to them. "Phoenix 2, extend your orbit to the south and watch for any movement on those ridgelines," Morrison ordered. Maria banked her helicopter to the right, giving her crew a better view of the surrounding terrain. Johnson leaned out with binoculars, scanning the rocky slopes for any sign of enemy fighters. The mountains were full of caves and crevices where someone could hide with a rocket-propelled grenade. "Phoenix 1, I've got movement in the valley," called the pilot of the Overwatch helicopter. "Looks like 3 personnel moving toward the LZ from the northeast." Maria could see them now too, 3 figures in camouflage uniforms running across the open ground toward the predetermined extraction point. But something was wrong. The intelligence briefing had mentioned a 5-man team, not 3. Morrison's helicopter began its approach to the landing zone, flaring to slow down for touchdown. As soon as the aircraft settled onto the ground, the 3 soldiers sprinted toward it. But instead of climbing aboard immediately, they stopped and gestured frantically back toward the ridgeline. "Phoenix 1, those soldiers are saying something," the Overwatch pilot reported. "Looks like they're trying to tell you something important." Through her binoculars, Maria could see one of the soldiers pointing toward a position on the eastern ridge. Then she saw muzzle flashes, small sparks of light that meant someone was shooting at Morrison's helicopter. "Phoenix 1, you're taking fire from the east ridge," she called over the radio. Morrison's helicopter immediately lifted off, climbing rapidly to get out of range of the ground fire. But the 3 soldiers were left behind on the ground, running for cover behind some rocks near the landing zone. "Phoenix Flight, we've got a problem," Morrison announced. "Ground team says they're missing 2 personnel who are wounded and can't move. They're located in a cave system about half a mile up the valley." This changed everything. The original plan had been for a simple pickup of 5 mobile soldiers. Now they were looking at a much more complex operation involving wounded personnel in a location that wasn't suitable for helicopter landing. Maria studied the terrain, looking for alternatives. The cave system Morrison mentioned was located on a steep slope that would be impossible for a helicopter to access directly. But there was a small flat area about 200 meters below the caves that might work as a landing zone. "Phoenix 1, I can see a potential LZ about 200 meters below the cave position," she radioed. "It's small, but it might work." "Negative, Phoenix 2, Morrison replied quickly. "That area is too close to enemy positions. We need to find another solution." But Maria could see that there wasn't another solution. The wounded soldiers couldn't be moved very far, and every minute they delayed gave the Taliban more time to bring additional fighters to the area. Someone needed to make a decision quickly, before the situation became completely impossible. As she watched, more muzzle flashes appeared on the ridgelines around the valley. The enemy was definitely present in force, and they were positioning themselves to prevent any rescue attempt. The 3 mobile soldiers were still pinned down behind the rocks, unable to reach either helicopter. Maria realized that the mission was falling apart, and if they didn't act soon, all 5 members of the reconnaissance team would be captured or killed. The textbook solution would be to call for additional support, maybe fighter aircraft or attack helicopters, but that would take time they didn't have. She made a decision that would change everything that followed. "Phoenix 1, I'm going in for the wounded," Maria announced over the radio, banking her helicopter toward the small landing zone she had identified. Phoenix 2 negative. Morrison's voice was sharp with authority. That LZ is too hot. Return to holding pattern. But Maria had already committed to the approach. She could see the situation deteriorating by the minute. More enemy fighters were moving into position on the ridgelines, and the 3 soldiers on the ground were running low on ammunition. If they waited much longer, the entire reconnaissance team would be lost. Martinez, get the medical supplies ready, she called to her crew chief. Johnson, watch those ridgelines. Call out any muzzle flashes you see. The helicopter descended rapidly toward the narrow strip of flat ground. Maria had to thread the aircraft between 2 large boulders while avoiding the steep slope that dropped away on the eastern side. It was precision flying at its most demanding, requiring her to hover within inches of disaster. As they approached the landing zone, enemy fire intensified dramatically. Bullets cracked past the cockpit, and Maria could hear the distinctive sound of rounds hitting the aircraft's armor plating. Johnson returned fire with the door-mounted machine gun, sending long bursts toward the enemy positions. Taking hits on the right side, Martinez reported, but everything still looks good back here. Maria touched down on the rocky surface and immediately called out over the helicopter's external loudspeaker. Where are the wounded? One of the soldiers from the reconnaissance team came running from the cave entrance about 50 meters away. He was carrying a rifle and had multiple ammunition pouches strapped to his vest. When he reached the helicopter, he had to shout over the engine noise. 2 men inside the cave, both shot in the legs. We can carry them, but it'll take time. How much time? Maria shouted back. 5 minutes, maybe 10. 10 minutes was an eternity when you're sitting on a landing zone under enemy fire. But Maria knew they had no choice. She keyed her radio microphone. Phoenix 1, I'm on the ground. 2 wounded personnel in the cave. Need 10 minutes for extraction. Morrison's response was immediate and angry. Phoenix 2, you are ordered to abort and return to base immediately. Maria looked at her crew. Martinez was already gathering medical supplies and preparing to assist with the wounded soldiers. Johnson was scanning the ridgelines with his weapon, ready to provide covering fire. Both men were waiting for her decision. We're not leaving without those soldiers, she announced over the intercom. Phoenix 2, you are disobeying a direct order. Morrison's voice was reaching a dangerous pitch. Maria switched off her radio. She couldn't afford to listen to Morrison's arguments while she was trying to keep her helicopter and crew alive. The mission was clear. Bring home the reconnaissance team. Everything else was politics. Enemy fire was coming from at least 3 different positions now. Maria could see muzzle flashes on the north ridge, the east ridge, and from a position somewhere down the valley. The Taliban fighters had them surrounded, but they were still maintaining enough distance to avoid Johnson's return fire. Martinez, take 2 men and go help bring out the wounded, Maria ordered. Johnson, keep those ridgelines suppressed. Martinez grabbed a medical bag and jumped out of the helicopter, followed by 2 of the reconnaissance soldiers. They ran toward the cave entrance while Johnson swept the surrounding ridgelines with accurate bursts of machine gun fire. Maria kept the helicopter at a hover, ready to lift off immediately if the enemy fire became too intense. The turbine engines were running at high power, consuming fuel rapidly, but she knew they had enough for the extraction and the flight back to base. The bigger concern was the increasing accuracy of the enemy fire. A bullet shattered the side window of the cockpit, sending glass fragments across the instrument panel. Maria felt a sharp sting on her cheek, but ignored it. She adjusted the helicopter's position slightly to put one of the large boulders between her aircraft and the most active enemy position. Through her damaged window, she could see Martinez and the soldiers carrying the first wounded man from the cave. He appeared to be unconscious, with his legs wrapped in bloody bandages. The soldiers were moving as quickly as they could, but carrying a wounded man across rough terrain was slow work. Contact right, Johnson called out, swinging his weapon toward a new threat. A Taliban fighter had appeared on a ledge about 200 meters away, carrying what looked like an RPG launcher. Johnson's machine gun chattered, sending a stream of bullets toward the position. The fighter disappeared behind cover, but Maria knew he would be back. The first wounded soldier was loaded into the helicopter. He was conscious but in obvious pain, with bullet wounds in both legs that had been bandaged with field dressings. Martinez immediately went to work. checking the soldiers' vital signs and starting an IV line to combat blood loss. "One more coming," Martinez reported over the intercom. The second wounded soldier was in worse condition. He had been hit in the upper leg by what appeared to be a large-caliber bullet and had lost significant blood despite the bandages. The reconnaissance soldiers were having difficulty carrying him, and Maria could see they were exhausted from 2 weeks of operations behind enemy lines. Enemy fire was intensifying as the Taliban fighters realized what was happening. Maria counted muzzle flashes from at least 5 different positions now, and the accuracy was improving as the fighters adjusted their aim. A bullet punched through the helicopter's tail boom, fortunately missing any critical components. "Phoenix 2, this is Phoenix 1. Morrison's voice crackled over the radio, which Maria had switched back on. "You have enemy reinforcements moving up the valley from the south. Estimate 2 dozen fighters with heavy weapons." That was the information Maria had been dreading. If the Taliban brought heavy machine guns or more RPGs into range, her helicopter would become an easy target. She keyed her microphone. "How much time do we have?" "Maybe 5 minutes before they're in effective range." 5 minutes to load the last wounded soldier and get out of the valley. Maria watched as Martinez and the reconnaissance team struggled to carry the unconscious man across the rocky ground. They were moving as fast as they could, but it wasn't fast enough. The RPG fighter reappeared on his ledge, and this time he had a clear shot at the helicopter. Maria saw him shoulder the launcher and aim in their direction. There was no time to move the aircraft and no cover available. Johnson's machine gun roared, sending a long burst toward the enemy position. The Taliban fighter jerked backward and dropped the RPG launcher, which clattered down the rocky slope. Johnson had made an incredible shot at extreme range, possibly saving all their lives. "Nice shooting, Corporal," Maria called over the intercom. "Thank you, ma'am, but there's more of them coming." The second wounded soldier was finally loaded into the helicopter. Both casualties were now receiving medical treatment from Martinez, who was working efficiently despite the chaos around them. The 3 mobile reconnaissance soldiers climbed aboard, bringing the total passenger load to 5 plus Maria's crew. "Everyone's on board," Martinez reported. "We're ready to go." Maria pulled power and lifted the helicopter off the landing zone just as a mortar round exploded where they had been sitting. Someone in the Taliban force had brought indirect fire weapons into the battle, making the area even more dangerous for aircraft. As they climbed out of the valley, Maria could see the enemy reinforcements Morrison had warned about. A long line of Taliban fighters was moving up the valley floor, carrying a variety of weapons, including what appeared to be a recoilless rifle that could destroy a helicopter with a single shot. "Phoenix 1, Phoenix 2 is airborne with 5 personnel on board," Maria reported. "Both wounded are stable and receiving medical treatment." Morrison's response was cold and professional. "Phoenix 2, return to base immediately. We'll discuss your actions when we get back." The flight back to forward operating base Phoenix took 45 minutes. Maria kept the helicopter at maximum speed, using every bit of cover the terrain provided to avoid possible enemy fire. The 2 wounded soldiers remained stable throughout the flight, thanks to Martinez's medical skills and the IV fluids they had received. As they approached the base, Maria could see ambulances waiting on the flight line. Word of the mission had obviously spread, and the medical personnel were prepared to receive casualties. She made a smooth landing near the hospital, and the wounded soldiers were transferred to stretchers within minutes. Colonel Thompson was waiting when Maria shut down her engines. His expression was unreadable, giving no indication of whether she was in trouble or being commended for the successful rescue. Behind him stood Morrison and several other pilots, all looking serious. "Santos, report to my office in 30 minutes, the colonel said. "Bring your crew." Maria nodded, understanding that the real consequences of her actions were about to be determined. She had disobeyed direct orders from her flight leader, but she had also saved the lives of 2 wounded soldiers who would have been left behind otherwise. Martinez and Johnson were busy with post-flight inspections, documenting the battle damage the helicopter had sustained. Maria counted at least 15 bullet holes in various parts of the aircraft, but somehow none of them had hit anything critical. They had been incredibly lucky. "Ma'am," Martinez called out, "you should see this." He was pointing to a hole in the fuselage just behind the cockpit. A bullet had punched through the aircraft's skin and struck the back of Maria's seat, stopping just inches from where she had been sitting. If the angle had been slightly different, or if the bullet had been traveling a few feet per second faster, it would have killed her. "Close call," Johnson observed. "Too close," Maria agreed. As she walked toward the operations building, Maria reflected on what had just happened. She had made a split-second decision to ignore orders and attempt a dangerous rescue operation. The mission had succeeded, but success didn't necessarily mean she had made the right choice from a military perspective. Military discipline depended on soldiers following orders, even when they disagreed with those orders. By disobeying Morrison's commands, she had violated one of the fundamental principles of military service. But she had also upheld another fundamental principle: never leave a fellow soldier behind. The next 30 minutes would determine whether her career as a military pilot would continue or come to an abrupt end. Maria knew that Colonel Thompson was a fair officer who cared about his soldiers, but he also had to maintain discipline within his command. Allowing subordinates to disobey orders, even for good reasons, could lead to chaos and disaster in future operations. She used the time before the meeting to clean up and change into a fresh uniform. The bullet fragments had left small cuts on her face and hands, but nothing serious enough to require medical attention. More importantly, she needed to prepare her explanation for what had happened in the valley. Maria knew she could simply claim that radio communications had been unclear and that she had misunderstood Morrison's orders. It would be a lie, but it might save her career. Alternatively, she could tell the truth and accept whatever consequences followed. As she walked toward Colonel Thompson's office, Maria made her decision about how to handle the upcoming confrontation. The choice she made would determine not only her own future, but also whether the military would continue to view her as the dead weight pilot who didn't belong in combat operations. Colonel Thompson's office was spartanly decorated with military maps, unit awards, and a single photograph of his family back in Colorado. Maria stood at attention in front of his desk, flanked by Martinez and Johnson. Captain Morrison sat in a chair off to the side, his face stern and disapproving. "At ease," Colonel Thompson said, gesturing for them to relax their posture. "Santos, I want to hear your version of what happened today. Take your time and don't leave anything out." Maria had decided during her walk to the office that she would tell the complete truth, regardless of the consequences. She began with her assessment of the tactical situation in the valley, explaining why she believed the wounded soldiers would have been lost if they had waited for additional support or tried to find an alternative extraction method. "I could see that enemy reinforcements were moving into the area," she said. "The 3 mobile soldiers were pinned down and running low on ammunition. The 2 wounded men in the cave couldn't be moved without assistance, and every minute we delayed gave the Taliban more time to bring heavy weapons into range." Colonel Thompson listened without interruption, occasionally making notes on a pad in front of him. Morrison's expression grew increasingly dark as Maria described her decision to ignore his orders and proceed with the dangerous extraction. "I understand that I disobeyed Captain Morrison's direct commands," Maria continued. "But I felt that the mission objective, bringing home all 5 members of the reconnaissance team, took priority over flight formation procedures." When she finished her account, Colonel Thompson turned to Martinez and Johnson. "Sergeant Martinez, what's your assessment of Sergeant Santos's actions during the mission?" Martinez straightened slightly. "Sir, Sergeant Santos made the right call. Those wounded soldiers would have died if we hadn't gone in. She kept the aircraft steady under fire, gave clear directions to the crew, and got everyone out alive." Corporal Johnson: "I agree with Sergeant Martinez, sir. Sergeant Santos showed courage and skill under extremely difficult conditions. Her flying was outstanding, and her decisions saved lives." Colonel Thompson nodded, then turned to Morrison. "Captain, I'll hear your perspective now." Morrison's voice was tight with controlled anger. "Sir, Sergeant Santos directly disobeyed my orders and endangered the entire mission. Military discipline requires that subordinates follow the chain of command, especially in combat situations. If we allow junior personnel to ignore orders whenever they disagree, we'll have chaos instead of a functioning military unit." "Did you consider attempting the extraction yourself?" the colonel asked. Morrison hesitated. Sir, the landing zone was too small and too heavily defended for a safe extraction. I made the tactical decision to call for additional support rather than risk losing more personnel. How long would that support have taken to arrive? Approximately 30 minutes, sir. And in your assessment, would the reconnaissance team have survived that long? Morrison's hesitation was longer this time. That's difficult to say, sir. Possibly not. Colonel Thompson leaned back in his chair, studying the four people in his office. The silence stretched for nearly a minute before he spoke again. Sergeant Santos, your actions today present me with a difficult dilemma. On one hand, you violated the chain of command and disobeyed direct orders from your flight leader. That kind of behavior cannot be tolerated in a military organization. Maria felt her heart sinking. She had known this was a possibility, but hearing the words spoken aloud made the reality more painful. On the other hand, the colonel continued, you demonstrated exceptional flying skill, sound tactical judgment, and the kind of courage that exemplifies the best traditions of military service. More importantly, 5 American soldiers are alive tonight because of your actions. He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the flight line where helicopters were being prepared for evening missions. Captain Morrison, you're dismissed. Report to my office at 800 tomorrow for a separate discussion. Morrison looked surprised, but he stood and left the office without saying anything further. Maria wondered what that separate discussion would involve, but she kept her attention focused on Colonel Thompson. The 3 of you remain, the colonel said after Morrison had gone. What happened today tells me that we have some problems in this squadron that go beyond a single mission. He returned to his desk and pulled out a thick folder. I've been reviewing performance reports and mission records for the past 6 months. Sergeant Santos, did you know that you have the highest mission completion rate of any pilot in this squadron? Maria blinked in surprise. No, sir, I wasn't aware of that. 94%, the colonel said, reading from the file. You've successfully completed every mission you've been assigned except for one that was aborted due to weather conditions beyond anyone's control. Your aircraft maintenance record is exemplary, and your crew evaluations are outstanding. He looked up from the file. So explain to me why several pilots in this squadron consider you a liability. The question hung in the air like a live grenade. Maria knew the answer, but saying it aloud would mean directly confronting the discrimination she had been experiencing for months. Sir, I believe some personnel have difficulty accepting female pilots in combat roles, she said carefully. That's a diplomatic way of putting it, Colonel Thompson replied. I've been hearing reports of inappropriate comments and behavior for months. I should have addressed this situation sooner. He closed the file and looked at each of them in turn. Here's what's going to happen. Sergeant Santos, you will not face any disciplinary action for today's mission. Your actions were tactically sound and morally correct, even if they violated strict protocol. Maria felt a wave of relief wash over her. Thank you, sir. Don't thank me yet, the colonel continued. I'm assigning you as the new flight leader for all high-risk missions. That means you'll be responsible for planning and executing the most dangerous operations we conduct. Think you can handle that? Maria felt her breath catch. Flight leader meant she would be in command of other pilots, including some who had been questioning her abilities for months. It was an opportunity she had dreamed about, but it also meant taking on enormous responsibility. Yes, sir, I can handle it. Good, because our next operation is going to be the biggest and most dangerous mission this squadron has ever attempted. Colonel Thompson moved to the large map on his office wall. Red pins marked recent enemy activity, and blue arrows showed American troop movements. The situation was clearly complex and evolving rapidly. Intelligence reports indicate that a large Taliban force is planning a coordinated attack on 3 of our forward operating bases, he explained. The attack is scheduled for tomorrow night, and it's designed to overrun our positions before we can respond effectively. Maria studied the map, recognizing immediately that the bases were too far apart for mutual support. If the Taliban attacked all 3 simultaneously, each position would have to defend itself until reinforcements could arrive. However, the colonel continued, we've received detailed information about the Taliban staging area where they're massing their forces. It's located here, in this valley about 40 kilometers from our easternmost base. He pointed to a location that Maria recognized as extremely difficult terrain. The valley was narrow and surrounded by high ridges, similar to where they had conducted the morning's mission, but much larger and more complex. The plan is to insert a large force of Marines into the staging area just before dawn tomorrow. If we can disrupt their preparations and destroy their supplies, we can prevent the coordinated attack on our bases. Maria could see immediately that this would require multiple helicopter insertions under dangerous conditions. The Taliban would certainly have the area defended, and flying large numbers of helicopters into a narrow valley would be risky under the best circumstances. "How many aircraft, sir?" she asked. 12 Black Hawks carrying a full Marine company, plus 4 Apache attack helicopters for support. 12 helicopters flying in formation through mountain terrain at night, then conducting combat insertions under fire. It was the kind of operation that could either be a stunning success or a catastrophic disaster, depending on the planning and execution. "Sergeant Santos, you'll be the overall flight leader for the mission," Colonel Thompson said. "You'll be responsible for coordinating all aircraft movements, managing the insertion sequence, and making tactical decisions if the situation changes." Maria felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. Commanding a 12-aircraft formation was something she had trained for but never actually done in combat. The lives of hundreds of Marines and aircrew would depend on her decisions. "Sir, some of the pilots might have difficulty accepting orders from a junior NCO," she said diplomatically. "That's their problem, not yours," the colonel replied firmly. "I'll make it very clear that you have my full authority for this mission. Anyone who has a problem with that can discuss it with me personally." He handed her a sealed envelope. "Mission planning begins in 2 hours. All aircraft commanders will report to the briefing room at 1900. Study these preliminary plans and come prepared with your recommendations for improvement." As they left the colonel's office, Martinez whistled softly. "Ma'am, you just went from being the squadron outcast to leading the biggest mission of the deployment." "Think the other pilots will accept it?" Johnson asked. Maria considered the question as they walked back toward their quarters. Some pilots would follow her orders because Colonel Thompson had made it clear they had no choice. Others might genuinely respect her abilities after seeing what she had accomplished during the morning's mission. But there would definitely be some who would resent taking orders from someone they considered inferior. "We'll find out soon enough," she said. That evening, Maria spent 3 hours studying the mission plans and developing her own tactical recommendations. The operation was ambitious and complex, requiring precise timing and flawless coordination between multiple aircraft. She identified several potential problems and developed alternative approaches for different scenarios. The intelligence package included detailed aerial photographs of the target area, intercepted radio communications, and assessments of enemy strength and capabilities. The Taliban force appeared to be larger and better equipped than usual, with experienced fighters and modern weapons. As she prepared for the mission planning meeting, Maria reflected on how dramatically her situation had changed in a single day. This morning, she had been fighting for respect and acceptance within her own squadron. Tonight, she was responsible for planning and executing the most critical mission of the deployment. The irony wasn't lost on her that the same qualities that had made her fellow pilots question her suitability, her willingness to take risks, her focus on mission success over personal safety, her refusal to accept good enough, when better was possible, were exactly the qualities that Colonel Thompson valued in a flight leader. But respect earned through a single successful mission could be lost just as quickly if the next operation went badly. Tomorrow's insertion would be the real test of whether she deserved the confidence Colonel Thompson had placed in her. As Maria walked toward the briefing room, she saw several pilots gathered near the entrance. They stopped talking when they saw her approaching, and she could feel their eyes evaluating her, wondering if she was really capable of leading them into combat. Captain Morrison was among them, and his expression was particularly hostile. Colonel Thompson's separate meeting with him had obviously not gone well, and Maria suspected she would be dealing with the consequences of that conversation for weeks to come. But as she entered the briefing room and took her place at the front of the room, Maria felt a sense of calm confidence settling over her. She had earned this opportunity through skill, dedication, and courage. Now she had to prove that she deserved it. The briefing room fell silent as Maria took her position at the front. 12 helicopter pilots and their crew members filled the chairs, along with Marine officers who would be leading the ground assault. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Colonel Thompson entered and immediately addressed the elephant in the room. "Gentlemen, Sergeant Santos will be serving as flight leader for tomorrow's operation. She has my complete confidence and authority to make tactical decisions during the mission. Any questions about the chain of command should be directed to me personally." His tone made it clear that questioning Maria's authority would be career suicide. The pilots nodded their understanding, though Maria could see skepticism in several faces. "Sergeant Santos, brief the mission," Colonel Thompson ordered. Maria moved to the large map display and began her presentation. She had spent hours preparing, and her briefing was thorough and professional. She explained the intelligence picture, the tactical objectives, and the insertion plan she had developed. "We'll approach the target valley in 3 formations of 4 aircraft each," she began. "Formation Alpha will insert Marines on the northern ridge to establish overwatch positions. Formation Bravo will land troops in the valley floor to secure the Taliban supply depot. Formation Charlie will provide reserve forces and medical evacuation capability." She used a laser pointer to trace flight routes on the map, showing how each formation would approach from different directions to avoid giving the enemy a concentrated target. The timing would be critical. All insertions had to be completed within a 15-minute window to maintain the element of surprise. "Expected enemy strength is approximately 200 fighters with small arms, mortars, and possibly surface-to-air missiles," Maria continued. "Intelligence suggests they've been expecting an attack and have prepared defensive positions throughout the valley." One of the senior pilots, Chief Warrant Officer Reynolds, raised his hand. "What's our abort criteria? If we start taking heavy casualties, at what point do we pull back?" It was a good question that went to the heart of mission planning. Every operation needed clear criteria for when to continue despite losses and when to abort to prevent disaster. "Abort if we lose more than 2 aircraft during the initial insertion," Maria replied. "Once the Marines are on the ground, we continue unless ordered to withdraw by the ground commander." Captain Morrison spoke up for the first time. "What makes you think this plan will work better than a conventional approach? Why not use the Apache attack helicopters to suppress enemy positions before we insert troops?" Maria had anticipated this question. "The Apache will be providing fire support, but preliminary bombardment would eliminate our surprise advantage. The Taliban would have time to move their supplies and reposition their forces. Our best chance is a rapid insertion that gives them minimal time to react." Morrison wasn't satisfied. "That's a lot of risk based on maintaining surprise. What if the intelligence is wrong? What if they're expecting us?" "Then we adapt," Maria said simply. "That's why we have multiple formations approaching from different directions and reserve forces ready to respond to changing conditions." The briefing continued for 2 hours, covering everything from fuel calculations to emergency procedures. Maria answered questions confidently, drawing on her experience and training to address each concern. Gradually, she could see some of the skepticism in the room beginning to fade. Major Williams, the Marine commander who would be leading the ground assault, stood to address the pilots. "I want you all to know that my Marines have complete confidence in this plan. We've reviewed the tactical approach, and we believe it gives us the best chance of success." That endorsement from the ground commander carried significant weight with the pilots. If the Marines were willing to trust their lives to Maria's plan, it was harder for the aircrews to question her judgment. After the formal briefing ended, pilots gathered in small groups to discuss details and coordinate their individual preparations. Maria noticed that some were making an effort to include her in their conversations, while others were pointedly ignoring her presence. Chief Warrant Officer Blake approached her as the room was clearing. Blake was one of the most experienced pilots in the squadron, with 3 combat deployments and a reputation for steady nerves under fire. "Good briefing, Santos," he said. "I think your plan has a solid chance of working. You want some advice for tomorrow?" Maria nodded, "Always. Don't second-guess yourself once we're airborne. Trust your instincts and make decisions quickly. The pilots will follow you if you project confidence, but they'll smell uncertainty from a mile away." It was good advice from someone who had been in similar positions before. Maria thanked Blake and headed back to her quarters to get some sleep before the 300 mission launch. But sleep didn't come easily. Maria's mind kept racing through different scenarios and contingencies, imagining everything that could go wrong during the operation. Leading a complex mission was like conducting a symphony orchestra while flying through a thunderstorm. Every element had to work together perfectly, or the entire performance would collapse. At 200, she gave up trying to sleep and headed to the flight line for her pre-mission inspection. Her crew chief, Martinez, was already there running through the maintenance checklist by flashlight. The helicopter had been repaired from the previous day's battle damage and was ready for another demanding mission. "How are you feeling about today, ma'am?" Martinez asked as they completed their inspection. "Ready," Maria replied, and she meant it. Despite the pressure and responsibility, she felt more prepared for this mission than any other she had flown. The planning had been thorough, the pilots were professional despite their personal reservations, and the mission objective was clear and important. Johnson arrived with his weapons and equipment, moving with the quiet efficiency of an experienced soldier preparing for combat. The three of them had become a solid team over their months of flying together, and Maria trusted both men completely. As dawn approached, the 12 helicopters started their engines in sequence. The sound was incredible, 12 powerful turbine engines spooling up simultaneously, creating a symphony of mechanical power that could be heard for miles. Maria felt the familiar rush of adrenaline that came with the start of every mission. "Phoenix Flight, this is Phoenix Leader," Maria called over the radio. "Check in for departure." One by one, the pilots reported their readiness. Even Morrison's voice was professional and correct as he acknowledged his position in the formation. "Phoenix Flight, we are cleared for departure. Time to show these guys what American air power can do." The formation lifted off in perfect coordination, climbing rapidly into the pre-dawn darkness. Maria led them on a circuitous route toward the target area, using the terrain to mask their approach and avoid early detection by enemy observers. Flying a 12-aircraft formation required constant attention and communication. Maria monitored her position relative to the other helicopters while navigating through the mountains and coordinating with the Apache attack helicopters that were approaching from a different direction. As they neared the target valley, the first hints of dawn were beginning to appear on the eastern horizon. The timing was perfect. They would have just enough light to see their landing zones without giving the enemy advanced warning of their approach. "Phoenix Flight, target valley in sight," Maria announced. "Execute Plan Alpha. All formations break on my mark." The 12 helicopters separated into their assigned groups, each heading toward different insertion points in the valley. Maria could see the Taliban staging area below, hundreds of tents, vehicles, and supply stockpiles scattered across the valley floor. Intelligence had been accurate about the size of the enemy force. But something was wrong. The valley was too quiet, with no visible signs of normal morning activity. No cooking fires, no movement between the tents, no sentries visible at defensive positions. "Phoenix Leader, this is Apache Lead," called the attack helicopter commander. "Valley appears to be abandoned. No heat signatures, no movement." Maria's heart sank as she realized what had happened. Either their intelligence had been wrong, or the Taliban had discovered the planned attack and moved their forces during the night. The entire operation was based on hitting a target that might no longer exist. But 47 Marines were counting on her decision. She had seconds to choose between aborting the mission and proceeding with the insertions despite the changed tactical situation. "All formations proceed with insertions," Maria ordered. "We need ground truth before we can assess the situation." The helicopters dove toward their landing zones as Maria watched for any signs of enemy activity. If this was a trap, the Taliban would reveal themselves as soon as the aircraft were committed to landing. If the valley was truly abandoned, they would have to search for clues about where the enemy force had gone. Formation Alpha touched down on the northern ridge and immediately began disembarking Marines. Formation Bravo descended toward the valley floor, approaching the apparent supply depot. Maria held Formation Charlie in overwatch position, ready to provide support if either of the other groups encountered resistance. The Marines spread out quickly from their landing zones, moving with practiced efficiency toward their objectives. Within minutes, radio reports began coming back from the ground teams. "Phoenix Leader, Alpha Team reporting. Northern positions appear abandoned but show signs of recent occupation. Fresh tire tracks and equipment marks. Phoenix leader Bravo team at the supply depot. Tents are empty but supplies are still here. Looks like they left in a hurry. Maria tried to piece together what was happening. The Taliban force had clearly been in the valley recently, but they had withdrawn before the American attack. That suggested either a security leak or an intelligence failure on the American side. Then the attack began. The first rocket-propelled grenade came from the eastern ridge, striking the ground near one of the landed helicopters. It was followed immediately by machine gun fire from multiple positions around the valley. The Taliban hadn't abandoned their positions. They had repositioned them to create a more effective ambush. All formations were taking fire from concealed positions, Maria called over the radio. Apache flight, we need immediate fire support on the eastern ridge. The Apache attack helicopters swept into the valley, their 30-millimeter cannons blazing as they engaged the enemy positions. But more RPGs were being fired now, and Maria could see that several of her helicopters were in serious danger. Phoenix 11 reporting aircraft damage, came an urgent call. Taking fire from multiple directions, need immediate extraction. Phoenix 11 was piloted by Captain Morrison, and Maria could see smoke beginning to trail from his helicopter. He was attempting to lift off from the valley floor, but enemy fire was intensifying around his position. Maria made another split-second decision that would define her legacy as a pilot. Formation, Charlie, follow me in. We're going to extract Phoenix 11 and provide cover for the ground teams. Phoenix leader, that valley is too hot, Blake's voice carried a warning. We could lose multiple aircraft. Phoenix 11 has 47 Marines on the ground, Maria replied. We're not leaving anyone behind. She dove her helicopter toward the valley floor, leading Formation Charlie directly into the heaviest concentration of enemy fire. It was exactly the kind of aggressive, risky flying that had made her fellow pilots question her judgment. But this time, they followed her without hesitation. As they descended into the chaos of battle, Maria knew that this mission would either prove her critics right or silence them forever. Either way, 47 Marines would make it home alive. The next 15 minutes would become the stuff of military legend, as the pilot they had called dead weight demonstrated why courage and skill mattered more than politics and prejudice. But that was a story for the medal citations and history books. Right now, there was only the mission and the soldiers who needed her help.